Everybody, and welcome to this CMCC webinar dedicated to urban adaptation in Europe. We will providing an overview on how European cities respond to climate change. The occasion for this webinar is the publication of the most recent report on urban adaptation published by the European Environment Agency on this argument. CMCC was directly involved in the writing of this report. Today we are happy to welcome two speakers, Aleksandra Kazmierczak, the lead author of the report, and Marianne Zandersen, one of my fellow members of the group of scientists which have collaborated in the writing of the report. I will briefly present the two of them to you. You can see them in the windows. Aleksandra Kazmierczak is an environment and health expert at the European Environment Agency. Before she recently moved to this section of the agency, she worked in urban and social aspects of adaptation for more than one decade. Aleksandra has a background in geography and spatial planning. And Marianne Zandersen is the senior researcher in environmental economics and the environmental social science and geography sections of Aarhus University. She has 20 years of experience working with research and advisory services around Europe, Africa, and Asia. Okay. So this webinar is part of a series of CMCC webinars dedicated to urban adaptation, in which different experts have already provided their perspectives on the argument from different points of view. I would like now to briefly introduce to you CMCC and give a few words on the group which has worked for this argument to better understand why we are presenting it. CMCC is a non-profit research organization which was established back in 2005 and became a foundation in 2015. Its mission is to provide excellent climate science and, most importantly, to facilitate interaction between climate science and society. It's deeply committed to promote sustainable policies for adaptation and mitigation of climate change. We are working in research divisions, so 9 of these. Today's contribution and my affiliation is to the division of economic analysis of climate impacts and policies. But we are closely working together with in project as needed with other sections and divisions in our partner divisions. And cities and coastal areas are one of the key topics CMCC is dealing with. One of our activities in CMCC is dedicated since many years to the straight collaboration with the European Environment Agency in the what is called the European Topic Center on Climate Change Impacts, Vulnerability and Adaptation. It is one of the topic centers supporting the work of the European Environment Agency. And CMCC is coordinating this topic center and is working together with research agencies and institutions across all Europe. Here you can see the map and their locations. The strategic objective of this collaboration is to support and inform policy development and implementation to the EEA, and focusing in particular on the implementation of the EU climate change adaptation strategies and all policies which are moving around this strategy. What we are doing is we are contributing to thematic assessment reports. You see a choice of these reports, to the feeding data for indicators and definition of indicators. And we are working on the providing information and organizing the Climate Adapter platform, which provides information on climate adaptation for policymakers. Within this group, there is one within the topic center, there is one group dedicated to urban themes, which is the ETC working group on urban and social aspects of adaptation, which I have been leading and co-leading for the past several years. We are contributing to the specific, this group is participating to the specific part of dedicated to urban adaptation inside the Climate Adapt platform, in particular formulating the urban adaptation support tool in collaboration with the Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. We are organizing and we are collaborating to the organization of the Urban Resilience Forum. We are contributing and writing reports, contributing to the urban adaptation reports, which EEA is publishing regularly since some years. About the most recent of these reports, we will be talking today. Our group is formed by some of the members of the ETC, and here you see the names of the members of the working group. Further to myself, also Katie Johnson is a CMCC researcher, and we have been working together with experts from Czechoslovakia, from Finland, from Belgium, and Denmark, and in particular with Aarhus University, where Marianne is coming from. Some practicalities for today's session: you will be muted and your video will be deactivated by default. If you need to intervene or ask questions, you can either raise your hands and I will keep an eye on that, or write in the Q&A section. Now I give the word to Aleksandra Kazmierczak, who is the lead author of this report. She will provide us an insight in the key messages and the key findings, and then after her to Marianne Zandersen from Aarhus University, who's one of my fellow researchers who have contributed to the providing contents for this report. So please, Aleksandra, the word to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. Let me just try and share my screen. Margaretha, could you please confirm when you start seeing my presentation?
Yes, Aleksandra.
Okay, wonderful. So once again, very warm welcome from Copenhagen to everyone. My name is Aleksandra Kazmierczak and I'm working at the European Environment Agency. I would like to start from maybe introducing the organization that I work for. We are one of the European Union's agencies, and our job, our mandate is to provide the policymakers as well as the general public with robust, independent and objective environmental information. As Margaretha mentioned already, we are very much a network organization. We don't work on our own, but we work with our network of member countries. Margaretha, could you please mute yourself? Many thanks. We are working with our network of member countries as well as with a broader network of experts from the scientific community across Europe. A couple of months ago, we published this most recent of assessments focusing on the urban adaptation to climate change in Europe. We tend to focus in terms of this subject on cities, firstly because Europe, of course, is a heavily urbanized continent, and we very heavily rely on cities as the economic engines of our economy. But also because cities are really fascinating microcosm of interactions between the climate, between the physical characteristics, between the social characteristics of urban areas. So cities are where the rich and the poor people live often very close to each other, might be very differently affected by heat waves or flooding. Cities where very densely built up city centers are next to green suburbs, where again the differences in temperature or how these environments respond to, for example, torrential rain can be very different. Another reason to focus on cities is that as opposed to mitigation, where we need the global efforts, where we all need to work together, adaptation is very local. It needs to respond to these very local characteristics in terms of the actions on how to address climate impacts. And local authorities, in particular in cities and towns, are very well placed to do that because they do have the relevant competencies. They are close to the citizens. They have the competencies in relation to, for example, spatial planning or social care, sometimes also directly in terms of healthcare, so they can really address the impacts through their competencies. The report looks in detail into a number of climate risks for cities, so I won't go through all of them, just wanted to highlight a couple. Heat in the European context is the most deadly climate impacts, and according to our estimates across Europe, 90,000 people lost their lives completely unnecessarily over the past 35 years due to exposure to heat. And the climate projections are indicating that the situation is likely to get worse in the future. We can see that we have projected extreme heat waves occurring more frequently in the near future, especially in the south and southeast of Europe. And we can also see that in some of those areas, there are cities with very strong urban heat island effect, which really exacerbates the impacts of heat on human health and well-being, as well as, for example, on infrastructure. So that is the sort of the European picture, but when we zoom into individual cities, we can also see that some of the most vulnerable facilities, such as, for example, hospitals, are really located within the urban heat island effect, where it's the most intense. And of course, hospitals need to be accessible, need to be located within city centers to serve the population well, but it also means that they tend to be more exposed to heat. In fact, we looked at 100 cities across Europe, and the detailed mapping of urban heat island done by Belgian partners in our ETC Veto. And it shows that over half of those hospitals are located in strong urban heat island effect, calling for urgent adaptation of those facilities. There are also other risks. For example, many of the great European cities are located on the coastline, and the projections for the future under the extreme climate scenario, which is not so improbable, are showing that there might be a sea level rise of 0.5 meter or more in those cities. It then translates into economic damages, and we can see that the relationship between the level of inundation and the level of damages is exponential. So a 0.5 meter increase in inundation may actually mean a tenfold or more increase in the damages associated with such flooding. So what is being done about urban adaptation in Europe? Actually quite a lot. Since the publication of the EU adaptation strategy in 2013, there's been a number of initiatives directly focused on cities. The establishment of the Mayors Adapt initiative, which was then merged with the Covenant of Mayors, really incentivized cities to sign up on adaptation and commit to adaptation planning and action. And as of April this year, I think 2,700 local authorities across Europe have signed up to this initiative. We can also see that all of the EU member states now do have a national adaptation strategy or national adaptation plan, very often providing explicit support to local authorities for implementation. We can also see that we have the EU Urban Agenda with one of the partnerships explicitly focused on climate change adaptation, working towards better funding, better regulation, and better knowledge for cities. And in the most recent initiatives in the European Green Deal, we can see the emphasis on cities and increasing resilience in the proposed European climate law. We can see the emphasis on city greening in the biodiversity strategy, and we are impatiently awaiting the publication of the new EU adaptation strategy in February next year. But when we actually look on the ground what's happening in cities, we can see that it's a bit less optimistic. The first thing to say is that there is actually no one general overview of where we are in terms of the local adaptation to climate change in Europe. So within the scope of the report, we looked at the Covenant of Mayors signatories as a sort of litmus test of what's happening in terms of urban adaptation or local adaptation in Europe. And what we found is that according to the self-assessment of cities, they assess their level of progress as the highest in terms of assessing the risks and vulnerability. So the darker the blue color on this chart, the sort of more advanced cities see themselves on a particular aspect. But when we go down and look at the implementation and the monitoring and evaluation, we can see the dark blue disappearing, indicating that actually not so many cities are implementing or monitoring their actions. And if we look at the types of actions that are being planned at the moment, we can see that most of them are actually so-called soft measures. So the measures that do not mean any structural interventions into the city fabric, that are much more about developing knowledge, for example, through flood mapping or heat mapping, mainstreaming climate change into existing documents, and so on. So it means that we really very urgently need to move from assessing the situation, from planning, to implementation and monitoring of the actions. A very important message coming from the report is that we really need to change the way we plan and construct our cities if we want them to be resilient to climate change. Some research from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission is indicating a very strong northwest-southeast divide in European cities in terms of the amount of green space publicly available to their citizens. And we see that many cities are trying to address the lack of green space or insufficient provision through different initiatives, through providing parks, also including some water features for cooling, also through engaging cities into tree planting campaigns, either directly or through crowdfunding, for example. We also need to think how we plan our cities in relation to river flooding. And many of the European cities are located on rivers for historic reasons. And we can see that in many cities across Europe, there is a very high proportion of the urban floodplains that is being built up either through urban fabric or through industrial and commercial uses. So we can see that, for example, in Switzerland, in Luxembourg, in Belgium, where significant proportions of floodplains are built up, potentially putting them at risk of flooding. We can also see that the construction in floodplains actually is not stopping, it's progressing in Europe, and nearly 400 square kilometers of floodplains across Europe were developed just within the scope of 6 years through the urban development and positioning of economic sites and infrastructure. So if we want to be more resilient to climate change and the potential higher risk of flooding, this needs to change. We also need to think how we plan our built environment and our infrastructure. What we found is that in many cities in Europe, there is a low proportion of separation of the sewers in terms of the sanitary sewers and stormwater sewers, meaning that if there is a torrential rain and overflooding, there are substantial risks to human health through the contaminated floodwaters. We can also see that in many cities, the sewers are quite old, which means that they were built in different climatic conditions and might not be suited to the more intense, heavy precipitation that is projected for many parts in Europe. So we need to think how we redesign this infrastructure and what other measures we implement. For example, smart blue-green roofs, like an initiative in Amsterdam, where the water can be collected or released according to the local weather forecast. Or we need to think about our houses, whether they are heat proof, and there is plenty of initiatives happening, improving the urban environment and improving the houses, for example, through increased shading to improve the thermal comfort of people in Europe. But all of this, of course, requires money. And in fact, the lack of money, the lack of funding of adaptation has been highlighted by the cities in Europe as one of the key constraints, key factors preventing them from local adaptation. This is because most of the cities actually rely on their local resources for funding adaptation. Whilst the European funds, for example, through the LIFE program or Interreg programs or research programs provide some funding to cities, they really only reach a handful of cities. And most of the adaptation actions are actually coming from the local budgets. So there is definitely a need for better funding for cities, improving the accessibility of funding from various sources for cities in order to progress urban adaptation. And finally, we actually need better knowledge. We need to know more what works and what doesn't, and in which conditions, in order to channel this public money in a right way. So here I will pass over to Marianne in a minute in her presentation to cover the issues of which of the measures have been found to be more efficient, which of the measures have higher cost-benefit ratios, whether we know actually enough what are the cost benefits of adaptation, whether it's better to invest in green spaces with many of the potential benefits for health and well-being, or is it better to do something else because there might be some trade-offs also associated. So I'm going to stop here and pass over to Marianne to talk in more detail about these issues, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. I'll just wait to share. Yes. So yes, thank you also very much for allowing me to speak here. So I'll be talking about one specific chapter in the report on effectiveness and cost efficiency of different adaptation measures. And what you see here is one example of an effective adaptation measure from the small town of Lemvig in Denmark, a very sturdy 350-meter concrete wall that can withstand a sea level rise of 2.10 meters. But at the same time, it serpents across the harbor front, creating new spaces for a lively harbor front. So that's one example of how adaptation measures can actually provide additional benefits. Change the slide. Yeah. So one of the key issues we looked at in this chapter is the RESIN Urban Adaptation Options Library. So RESIN is a Horizon 2020 project. It's ended now, but it's still a searchable database of peer-reviewed studies up to 2017. And it looks at the hazards of high temperatures, flooding, sea level rise, and water scarcity. And it categorizes a number of adaptation measures that you can see here. The numbers are European cases, and in brackets, it's the global cases or numbers. So you can see there's a fair number of adaptation measures for high temperatures and flooding, and far less in terms of water scarcity that have been gathered in this database. It also shows the number of studies and cases on effectiveness, where especially high temperature have a lot of cases to build on the evidence, whereas on benefit cost cases, there's more evidence in the flooding sector or hazard. And to the end, you can see the number of scientific papers that underpin this evidence. So in terms of the effectiveness, that means the capacity to reduce impacts of a given climate hazard. And they have been organized and classified into low, medium, and high. And you can find more about the methodology on that from the RESIN website. And in terms of the cost efficiency assessment, that's really about the overall value for money of an adaptation option. And the indicator that we use here and that RESIN also focused on is the benefit cost ratio. So anything above 1 means it's economically beneficial. So benefits outweigh costs. I'll talk about two hazards because time is limited. One is high temperature and the other is flooding. So the adaptation options to counter high temperatures involve anything from cool materials, water energy system, green infrastructure like nature in cities, shading, external shading or photovoltaic installations, urban configuration like how you orient streets and buildings, the transport system and water-based solutions, as you see one example here. And there are a number of indicators that have been used to measure effectiveness. And this task, we looked at grouping them according to categories that make sense for policymakers and planners. So they range from outdoor and indoor thermal comfort, reduction of air temperature and surface temperature, and reduction in energy consumption. So you can see that looking at the effectiveness of adaptation option also really very much depends on what is the indicator that you look for. And here you see a very rich table that you can find and study more in the report. It shows on the first column the categories of adaptation options and the specific options, and then you see at the top a range from not effective all the way up to highly effective. There are different sizes of these circles, and the larger the size, the more number of cases are the evidence of putting a circle for high or for low, and the intensity of the color indicates how many scientific articles are behind, and that's because one article can have several cases. Now the color code also means different things. So the green is about the outdoor thermal comfort, the blue indoor thermal comfort, yellow is air temperature, red is surface, and energy is the brownish color. And you can see that there's a wide variety of evidence according to the different categories and options of adaptation. If we take, for instance, green infrastructure, it has been found to be one of the most effective options to counter urban heat island effect. And especially parks and trees in terms of air temperature and outdoor thermal comfort, with both a high number of studies and cases indicating high effectiveness. Then you also find a more mixed results in terms of cool materials. So for instance, for cool facade and cool pavement in terms of surface temperature reduction, actually no impact has been found that is effective here. But if you look at a cool facade, a high effective measure, but not evidenced by many studies, but that doesn't mean that it's not relevant at all. But just not much study has been going on in that. That is very effective in terms of air temperature and indoor thermal comfort. So you can study more about this in the report. Now moving on to the cost efficiency, what the table didn't show was one of the very effective and cost-efficient adaptation options. It's heat wave warning systems, where benefit cost ratios from Madrid, London, and Prague have been found to range between 12 and all the way up to 3,700 times more beneficial than the costs. And that is definitely also a learning from the heat waves in Europe. On terms of the structural options, the table you just saw before, there is unfortunately very little evidence still from the peer-reviewed literature, and it's also very location specific, and it's predominantly related to green infrastructure. The benefit cost ratio levels that the studies reveal, they also quite a variety or a very wide range of benefits included, so that makes for differing levels of benefit cost ratio. So for instance, green roofs have been found to be mostly below 1, so cost outweigh benefits, but there are also cases of benefit cost ratio exceeding the double of costs. And the same thing for green walls. There is one case where benefits outweighs cost 3 times. But in general, they have been found to be below 1, and that really depends on what benefits have been included in the studies. Moving on to flooding as the second example I would like to show is the different options that have been included in the RESIN database. Is protection of assets, so that's primarily private buildings, the energy system, the structural flood protection infrastructure, as you see here in the picture, flood protection wall from Cologne, green infrastructure, so the nature in cities, infiltration techniques like retention basins, land use, zoning, room for the river, but also wastewater reuse and water storage. And the indicators to measure the effectiveness here has been on the degree to which it's effective in intercepting and storing water, or to reduce risks and impacts. And here you see the same type of table as before. It's a bit more simple because there are fewer indicators involved, but it really shows that amphibic houses, in terms, if we look at the top two, asset protection, so amphibic houses, elevated buildings and floating houses have been found to be highly effective, but it's very low number of studies. Whereas dry proofing, there's a more mixed picture, and wet proofing has more studies and it's found to be medium effective, for instance. If you look down to green infrastructure, a bulk of the studies have really been in the field of green roofs. And here you see there's a wide variety of effectiveness levels found. And it's also very much depending on whether the indicator was in absolute, like centimeters or meters, or percentage. So again, you will need to look more carefully into the studies to draw the specific conclusions. In terms of land use is another area of very high importance. Room for the river or rehabilitation of floodplains, you find studies that range from low to high effectiveness, whereas land use zoning, there's a uniform agreement across studies, and a fair bulk of them, that finds land use zoning not effective to intercept and store water. Moving to the, to go back here, these are individually assessed effectiveness of measures, but you can also think of combining like grey structural flood protection measures with green infrastructure interventions. And there's one example that you can read more about on the Climate Adapt website. It's from Poland, Zandersen, where renaturalization was done in 15 different locations of the river, of reservoirs and wetland. And that was combined with a modernization of river embankments and restoration of the dike, reconstruction of pump stations, and the construction of water discharge channels. And here in this particular example, the benefit to cost ratio is more than 2. So a very convincing example of creating effective and cost-efficient hybrid solutions. In terms of the cost efficiency of flooding, we can say that we generally find very few studies assessing the benefit-cost ratio per adaptation option. So even with few studies, and you could wish more, additional studies would need to also look at how options are effective in adapting to several climate hazards simultaneously. And also many of these options have considerable co-benefits that do not relate to adaptation measures, and that can really alter benefit-cost ratio if that is included. If you look at the average benefit-cost ratio from the RESIN database, you can see here that not many studies are involved, but the evidence there shows that really dike dams, route for the river, beach erosion prevention and beach nourishment have got very positive benefit-cost ratios. Green roofs and infiltration trenches are low but positive. And retention ponds and wetlands have below 1 benefit cost ratio. And again, there it really depends, for instance, for wetlands, what type of benefits do you include? So to sum up, really, what is important for these measurements for cost efficiency is that many of these adaptation options can address multiple hazards simultaneously, and often these studies do not look at the multiple hazard benefits from those adaptation. So for instance, we have found that trees are highly effective with regard to high temperatures and flooding. But there's also other aspects like soft adaptation that has got some really good impacts in terms of cross-departmental integration of adaptation in urban planning. And they also provide additional co-benefits to environment, society and economy, like the well-established impact or causal link between trees and parks with regard to human health and well-being, expanding green infrastructure connectivity has got a positive impact on biodiversity, and also generally creating a more attractive environment can be more attractive for many types of business, either dependent on a high quality environment or profiting from nicer surroundings. But these adaptation options can also exacerbate certain hazards. And in case of drought, that I haven't talked about here, but watering vegetation in cities in case of drought can put a lot of strain on limited freshwater resources. But that again can be designed if reuse of wastewater and recycling has been thought of, or rainwater harvesting. Vegetation can also exacerbate risks from windstorms, but at the same time, that same vegetation can also protect against windstorms. So it really depends on the level of the event and the robustness and quality of that vegetation. In terms of the grey infrastructure, the dikes and dams can displace flood risk downstream. So that calls for a holistic assessment of where to put this into place, and maybe also to combine it with room for the river and nature-based solutions. And they can also have negative impacts on other aspects of sustainability, like what we call maladaptation. And that can be in the case of air conditioning that increase energy consumption. So it really depends on where does that energy come from. High density contexts in cities have been shown in the US and Asia to increased need for daylighting, so that again puts a pressure on energy consumption. And in cases of desalination, like on the island of Gotland, that can have impact on the energy consumption and also on the coastal ecosystems. So to conclude, little is still known about the effectiveness and cost efficiency, so that's really a need to monitor and evaluate these implemented adaptation measures, and that's best done to create more links between research and cities where adaptation measures are implemented, to build up this knowledge base and to disseminate that knowledge. And there's also a very high need for transparency in the methods and assumptions in measuring the benefits. What intangible values do you include? What are your assumptions on your discount rate, etc.? And there's also a need to go beyond the assessment of single measures, especially for nature-based solutions where you have the benefits of multiple functions that are produced at the same time. And that also, regardless of an event of climate change or disaster hitting, a lot of multiple co-benefits can occur, and that can really change the benefit cost ratio. And then there's, of course, the need to consider risk of maladaptation and trade-offs. Just to say the lessons from this part of the report is, and also to link to what Aleksandra said before, that the planning and construction of cities really need to change. And soft adaptation, like warning systems, can bring substantial benefits in preventing risk occurring. And early warning and the links to disaster risk reduction are really crucial for urban adaptation. and recalling that adaptation options are really place-based and local. So that means even if you read about an option that appears not effective in the RESON database, it can still make good sense to use that in a specific location, and it can also prove to be effective. So it really needs a local view on this. Finally, the social justice aspects are really important for the effectiveness of adaptation options. And as Aleksandra said, rich and poor are living very close together in cities hit by the same hazards, but the impacts of the hazards are very different. So thank you very much.
Thank you to Marianne, to both of you, to Aleksandra and Marianne. While you were talking, many questions popped up. Some have somehow developed into a discussion among attendees, which I found really interesting and a nice effect of these. I would like to start with the more technical questions which were posed especially to Marianne's presentation. Anna Chiesura asks, have the benefits of urban biodiversity and citizens' well-being taken into account in the cost-benefit analysis and by the CBR?
Mostly not. In the studies that we review through the RESON database, it's been very technical, single measure impacts on the specific hazard. So that is also the argument that we bring forward in this report, that it can really change the weight of benefits if you include biodiversity, human well-being, and other sustainability aspects that adaptation options can bring along. So that is really important, and that's why there's a need for transparency. When you see a table like that with the evidence of effectiveness, well, what is actually behind it? And that is, you need to go inside the machine room of those studies. So thank you very much for your question. It's a very important one. I support it.
Yes, Marianne, and there are a series of machine room questions from Samir Safaya. Yeah. She started with, I did not understand a table, which was the first one when you introduced the concept of cost benefit and before you went into detailed examples of aspects investigated. Can you go back to that eventually and share once more your presentation to explain that better?
If I can move around here.
Go back. Yes, it was this one, I think. She did not well understand what were you meaning by effectiveness, cost benefit per measure.
These benefit cost cases, is this the question up here? So it shows the number of
it is more the cost efficient, the overall value for money on adaptation option.
So there are different ways of measuring cost efficiency, and one that the RESON database tried to do to harmonize across as many studies as possible was to compare costs and benefits. So if you have benefits on the top and the cost on the bottom of the denominator, then you can see what is the most important. And if you have a value of higher than 1, it means that benefits outweigh costs. And this is based on net present values. And they've tried to harmonize the discount rates and the time horizons to take account into that to create harmonized benefit cost ratios across the studies. And I hope that answers the question.
I hope so, yes. Then a next question to you. Why is land zoning such an inefficient adaptation measure? And there is immediately half an answer to both of you, Aleksandra and Marianne, by Marta Ollazabal. in our review of adaptation plans worldwide, which is an article which is about to be published now, we have seen that budgets are not allocated to adaptation options. So, to my viewpoint, prior that funding is a barrier. Evaluating the cost of adaptation implementation, including costs of benefits of operation, is a barrier. What is your view on that?
Oh, that was, I'd like to see that in writing. I don't think I got all that. In terms of the land use zoning here, that was based on, so the measure of indicator there is really the effectiveness in actually managing to store and intercept water. And it really links also to how effective is land use zoning in preventing flood events to occur. With the push that there is in Europe to actually construct in flood-prone areas. So it really shows that the land use zoning is a bit of a paper tiger, if I may say like that. It could be made more efficient, but in reality that is not what is happening.
Yeah, or perhaps in interpreting also Marta's objection is that things are being planned and not implemented. And then you come into the issue with funding. Or they're not being planned because it's known that funding won't be there. This could be an interpretation of what they are finding in their article.
Ah, interesting, thank you. Yeah, I would like to read that, if you could send that once it's...
Marta, if you could share this with us, this would be great. Thank you. Then there's a lot of indications of articles, but no, I won't. So it's quite difficult to keep on, because so for those who raised the hands, I'm now keeping that, just skimming some of the more punctual questions, and from Joachim Fallmann, thanks for the detailed work. There are numerous adaptation strategies known already and their benefits widely evaluated. I figured, however, particularly at local level, actual area development plans often prevent the measures from being put in action. What would be needed to more directly put these measures to actual applications addressing the needs of local community? Happy for your impulses on that. So adaptation strategies known.
Okay, if I can maybe jump in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that yes, in general, the spatial planning and development plan regulations, they have been identified by cities as both as something propelling the adaptation forward, as well as a potential barrier. So I think it really depends on the local law, or local regulations and conditions, what is possible and what is not. And I think that actually spatial planning and getting it right is absolutely key, but that usually needs to be addressed at the national level in terms of the sort of the overall framework of the regulations. So that's where the change sometimes needs to happen in order to enable the adaptation at the local level.
Okay, thank you. I hope that answers the question. And what is the response from public institutions such as municipalities and regions to these results? To both of you, perhaps also to Aleksandra especially.
Well, then issue with working at the European institution is that we don't have so much direct contact with cities. However, the report has been presented to the colleagues in the European Commission, but also, for example, the committee of the regions, which is grouping the politicians from European regions and cities. We also presented it or shared it with the Climate Adaptation Partnership under the EU Urban Agenda. So we are hoping that it will reach the cities as well, and we hope that we can serve as a sort of source of knowledge, but also inspiration in terms of the various case studies provided, what could be done and what is being done in other cities.
Thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to raised hands by Richard Toll, who asked to talk. Are you still there, Richard? No, he's gone. And Hans von Storch asked, can you tell about the public NGO type engagement for pushing for more and better adaptation, say in the context of Fridays for Future, or is it mostly a matter of discussion in the back rooms of administrations? So which relation is between local authority acting and initiatives like Fridays for Future?
I think that it very much varies depending on the location. I just had a quick look at the report, and it seems that non-governmental organizations are rather frequently involved in adaptation planning as the external stakeholders. And what we also found was that this is mainly happening in larger cities, that in smaller municipalities there tends to be a bit more direct involvement of citizens in adaptation planning. In larger cities it is the NGOs that tend to be the sort of intermediary between the administration and the citizens. My own sort of personal experience of NGO involvement being an absolutely key factor for climate change adaptation comes actually from the UK. When I was working at the University of Manchester in the northwest of England, it was actually the NGOs that were pushing the most for climate change adaptation, and they had a very strong influencing role on the local authorities and the regional authorities. So it really, I think, depends on the context, but there is definitely a role to play for the non-governmental organizations. And I think that, you know, when reports like this one are being picked up by, for example, the European Environmental Founders Group, to whom I presented one of the EEA reports, then they have the chance to sort of disseminate it to their networks, and then they can pick up on the messages and include that in their activities.
Thank you, Aleksandra. And I would like to give the floor to Marta Olazabal.
Hello.
Yes. Hi, Marta.
Yes, this is regarding my earlier question that I posted in the chat, and I think that it was too long, so it was not a very good way to question. Anyway, this is regarding to something that Aleksandra mentioned regarding the CDP data, where funding was seen as one of the main barriers for urban adaptation implementation, I guess. And I was wondering, because we have developed an assessment of plans, of adaptation plans worldwide, and we saw that one of the things that we were surprised, it was that budget was not allocated to the specific options and measures, and overall to the plans in general. So I was wondering if you see, I see that like a prior barrier to funding. I mean, but because it seems that we are unable to evaluate the implementation costs of adaptation and the cost and benefits of adaptation operation, in fact. So I was wondering, so this links both your presentation, and I was wondering how you see this in practice.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think that these sort of three important driving factors for city adaptation, which is the appropriate regulation, appropriate knowledge, and appropriate funding, they go sort of hand in hand. And I think that in general, there needs to be the knowledge about the effectiveness of the solutions and how much they cost before the funding can be committed. So in a way, sort of, if you flip it in a way, that Marianne's presentation should come first to sort of talk about the effectiveness and cost efficiency before we can talk about, okay, so what next? What can we do about that? Can we actually pay for that?
I can maybe also add that because there's little evidence, and the evidence that is there also at times shows both low and high effectiveness, that public or politicians, they put their head on the block, so to speak, to go out and do some major investments when they are not completely sure of what effect will this have, and they are on election every 4 years, or the administration level needs to argue this. So because it's so place-based and the intangible values are so important, and it's not mainstream to do this, that there's really a lot of development need in this area to make municipalities more safe in going out, for instance, and making major investments that we really need. And also to know what, if we do grey infrastructure, it will disrupt maybe transportation for a long period of time. But we have a tradition of thinking that that is more safe than to separate rain from the black and grey sewage water, for instance. But still, a lot of examples are happening on the ground around in Europe, and I think it's a matter of gathering those experiences to make other municipalities safe, or feel safer in endeavoring in the same direction. And I can add that the European Community has invested almost 300 million euros in projects of research, innovation and demonstration projects on nature-based solutions, for instance, and hybrid and peri-urban and urban studies, that all of them involve municipalities and NGOs and SMEs and research organizations. So there's a wealth of information coming out now, and the Commission this autumn also developed or published a set of valorization reports to bring forward this evidence of impacts of at least nature-based solutions.
Thank you. Looking forward to those then.
Yeah, I can share them afterwards if you send me your email, Marta.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. I don't know, Margaretha, maybe you are speaking, but you're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. What is your opinion about the small number of adaptation cases dedicated to water scarcity? Why is that so?
Yeah, good question. Oftentimes these studies also depend on funding for the researchers and the number of researchers involved in this. And there's also some cyclical effects in this. Something becomes suddenly a hot topic and researchers start working on that. So I think it's a wide range of reasons for that. And it does by no means show that this is not important. It's just a fact that not a lot have been done in research, and that can actually help funders and researchers to say, well, we need to know more about this here.
Yes, actually that, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that droughts are usually sort of considered as an non-urban issue and much more relevant to agriculture and other sectors outside of cities. So that could be another reason. And I also think that we have a lot to learn in Europe about the climate impacts that we have not got so much experience with, especially on a broader scale. For example, the vector-borne diseases or extreme droughts also affecting cities, or really big widespread wildfires and so on. All these things that we can expect in the future to become a problem.
Margaretha, I don't know if you're speaking. But,
the time, no, because I'm typing some answers to the many questions in the chat while you were talking.
Wonderful.
Sorry if I disturbed you, and every now and then I remember to mute myself. I would like to ask Samer once more. She already made some questions to the machine room. Please, Samer, can you put your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the wonderful presentations. I was just wondering about the CBR fluctuating in time. I assume this is kind of hard to measure. So considering the age of the study and the effectiveness, how do you measure that? I assume that it would change. So, and some things are much more longer term in terms of the cost benefit. So I don't know how static that is. And the other one was about also a bit of the surprise for why the land zoning was not so effective against flooding. And last one was more about wetland restoration and how that may impact, like, so for example, mangroves, and how does that shore up against the flood situation? I know that's not exactly a European issue, but certainly a big one globally.
Yeah, thank you, Samir, for these questions. So in terms of the benefit cost ratio and fluctuation of costs and benefits and these studies over time, this is work that's done in the RESIN database. We didn't manipulate in any way what was entered into the database, but I know that they looked at this and they attempted to harmonize it, and they also conducted some regression analysis to find out what are the impacts of the different variables on cost efficiency and on effectiveness. So there's a whole deliverable on this that I can send to you if you send me your email, because I can't answer right now. I can't remember.
Sure. That'd be great to know.
Yeah, and in terms of the land zoning, I'll need to look into that too, because I can't remember from the top of my head why that has not been particularly non-effective other than what I've said already. In terms of the wetland restoration, the table that we show, that is based on the European cases. And again, the wider benefits of wetland restorations for nutrient reduction and biodiversity and recreation, that has not been included in those studies. So they've been very single measure in terms of the benefits of avoided flooding, for instance. So that's why also the benefit cost ratio is below 1 here. And so that's why I would like to caution also about not to put too much emphasis on what do they show before you know what the studies show. And again, that transparency of we need to have those benefits covering all aspects, because especially in urban areas, space is scarce and multifunctionality is really a benefit in its own right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. And I will still resume some of the questions. One is still considering the evidence on nature-based solutions, which is quite recent. So some 7 or 10 years of experience with such solutions. How do you match this with the common belief, as the contributor called Theodoro Diardadis called this, of that nature-based solutions are so effective if we have only such a brief experience?
Well, brief experiences, I would say we don't have a brief experience. I've got one example case from the Pyrenees in Spain, where the Fusicas project is actually mimicking something that happened in 1915, a way of terracing a mountain slope in order to reduce erosion and landslide. And that has been in place for more than 100 years and really works. And they are trying to mimic that and put some more modern aspects into it. And because we know that nature has restorative and protective capacities, it is effective. But it depends on also what is the level of hazard that we are faced, and what is the locality and the people, the acceptance of this. All that is very important. So it's like it has been around for many, many years. It's got different names too. And for instance, in hydrological risk, it has been around in research since the 80s. So it's a new coined term, but the approach is not new, I would argue.
Thanks, perfect, Marianne. And as our time is really running out, one last contribution from a raised hand, Chigdem Koskunepkan. Can you please pose your question? Okay. He is not responding. Okay. Chigdem, are you there?
I just muted, I
Please
think.
unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, it was accidentally.
Okay, sorry. Okay,
Yeah, sorry about
thank
that.
you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for the presentations.
Thank you to for all your contributions, and for all the questions we could not answer. They are very interesting, and a lot of them provided also the occasion of having a further discussion. I wanted to remember you that the whole webinar is being has been recorded, and you will be able to watch it again on the video channel, the YouTube channel by CMCC. Go to the CMCC website, cmcc.it, and then look for the video channel. And you can always drop us an email, either to me or to Marianne or Aleksandra for more specific questions. You can find the report. Several questions have been made regarding the report. You can find the report on the webpage of the European Environment Agency without giving you now a complicated web link to be copied. Go to the European Environment Agency and have a look for the latest urban adaptation report. It will be easy to find. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Aleksandra and Marianne, some last words?
Yeah, it was great to see this big interest, and do by any means put your email in the chat and we can capture it if we didn't answer a question or you contact.
Yeah, I will copy all questions, which especially those not answered, and forward them to the to both Marianne and Aleksandra. And well, just to let you know, we had more than 200 participants during the webinar. Now a lot of people are going for lunch, and so we are still 140. Thank you to all of you, and for the good questions and for the interaction in the chat, and hope to see you soon again. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.